And welcome back to this series of videos preparing you for your internal assessment. So this video is on induction versus deduction. Now by the end of the video, you should be able to state the general principles involved with deductive and inductive reasoning. You should be able to describe simple examples of these types of reasoning and hopefully be able to link it into the scientific research process. So these are my references for this video. It includes a textbook, 2 websites, and also a series of videos on a website. So hopefully you'll start to get familiar with how the Harvard referencing system works. So let's just go through it in a very basic and general way. So we can say that induction goes from the particular to the general, whereas deduction is the other way. It goes from the general to the particular. So what do I mean by this? Let's look at them individually. Now, there's a very famous example regarding inductive reasoning. And it starts with a premise. Now this premise is that every swan I've ever seen is white. So these are particular pieces of information. You've seen a swan, it's white. That is a particular piece of information. Now from this, you could conclude that all swans are white. This would be an example of inductive reasoning. So you've gone from the particular pieces of information, and you've generalized the concept in your conclusion. Now, are all swans white? No, they're not. People from Australia will know that you can also get black swans. Okay? So even though the premise was true, and the conclusion was reasonable based on the information they had at the time, the conclusion wasn't true. Now, it might have been true, but the thing about inductive reasoning is that even if all the evidence you have suggests something, that doesn't necessarily make it true. There's always the black swan out there waiting to destroy your theory. Now, deduction, on the other hand, goes in the opposite way. So let's think about a chemistry example. Now, your premise could be that all noble gases are inert. Remember, the noble gases are group 0 or 8, depending on your periodic table. Inert means unreactive, don't react. Your second premise, neon is a noble gas. So you could conclude that neon is inert. This would be deductive reasoning. Okay, you haven't examined neon itself, but because you know it's a noble gas, and because you know all noble gases are inert, you can deduce that neon would also be inert. So deductive reasoning works well if the premises you have are true, and also that the deductions you make are sensible. Let's just link it to a scientific process. Now, in the previous video, we went through how scientific theories are not necessarily truth, and that the whole scientific process is about explaining the data you have to the best of your ability and determining theories from that. But remember, it was a cycle. Those theories are then further tested. So if our first premise is based on a scientific theory, that scientific theory is not necessarily 100% correct. Therefore, any deductions made from it, again, are not necessarily true. But if we go back to our general definitions from before, we are starting with the general statement, the general theory about the inertness of noble gases. And then we're going to something specific. something particular. The fact that one of the noble gases therefore must be inert. So overall, while inductive reasoning allows you to learn something potentially new about the world, deductive reasoning allows you to apply what you already know, or what you already think you know. So how can we apply this knowledge to your research process? Let's link it back to the internal assessment. So let's just look at these in general first. So with induction, you will have some sort of question that you want to investigate, but you don't know what the answer is going to be. You might have a hypothesis, but that is likely to be based on your own intuition rather than an actual rule. Now you determine an experiment to test your question. You then acquire data. This data is then used to make your conclusions, your theories. So you've started with particular pieces of information, your data, and then you've analysed that data, you've come up with a general conclusion, general rule, theory. Whereas with deduction, you already have a theory. This has already been determined in previous work. You then determine or devise an experiment using deductive reasoning, so you will take your hypothesis and you will base it on what the theory already says. So you're basically testing out the theory. You then acquire data, and from this, data will either support or oppose the original theory. So your conclusion would be either support or opposition to that original theory. So there's a slight difference in how you go about an inductive research process or a deductive research process. So let's think about a more specific process. What might you be doing in your internal assessment? So with induction, you normally start with some sort of literature review. Now, this might be to get an idea in the first place, or you might have an interest you want to investigate, and you just need some background information on it. Now, based on this literature review, you will devise a research question. From that, a hypothesis. Now, you will then create an experiment which is aiming to answer this question. And once you've designed your experiment, you run it, you get your data. So you now have your particular pieces of data. You then analyze this data and you start to put together your theory, your evaluation of the data. And from this, you can draw your conclusion. Now, this conclusion can lead to an overall theory, depending on the work you're doing. So we are starting with the data, with the particular pieces of information, and the process is about making a generalized conclusion. So you would do this sort of process if you are trying to determine something new. Deduction, on the other hand, would normally still start with a literature review, and you would review the theory that you're going to do your experiment on. So from this theory, you create a research question and a hypothesis. Now, if this theory is correct and you've made your experiment in a proper way, then your hypothesis should be true based on deductive reasoning. So you get your data and you analyze the data, and then you reach your conclusion. Now, this conclusion will either support or oppose the original theory. So hopefully you can see here how there are slightly different ways of going about the research process. Now, for your internal assessment, it is easier to do an induction process. Now, the actual process itself might not be easier. You still have to go through all the different steps, but it is easier to access the marks in the grading system. Now, I know we haven't gone through the grading system yet. We're going to in an upcoming lecture. But with the induction, it's much easier to access the marks on interests, creative thinking, etc. So it's likely that most of you will be following an induction process. So hopefully, you should now be able to state the general principles of inductive and deductive reasoning. You should be able to describe the simple examples we went through, or possibly come up with your own examples. And hopefully you can link the two different types of reasoning to slightly different research processes. Thank you for watching the video. I'll see you next time.